Amen, Selah, and blessed be to that beautiful music. Thank you, Anthony. What a delight to be able to hear you over Zoom. And I know it must be just as wonderful in the sanctuary. Thank you. It was an early evening in late spring, the kind of evening where the temperature is perfect and the smell of blossoming flowers hangs in the air. I was walking home from my part-time job as a receptionist at a dance studio, and when I reached a familiar crossroads, to my surprise and delight, I saw my partner at the time approaching. She beamed at me and exclaimed, "I was thinking about how much I love you, and I wanted to come meet you. Let's go get dinner." It's one of those moments that may sound ordinary as I recount it, but it seemed so completely magical at the time. I remember feeling so loved and feeling so much love for my partner. A warm, wonderful feeling that almost completely overwhelmed my senses. I was 20 years old, and I was sure our relationship was going to last forever. Well, you know what they say about famous last words. Our relationship ended in a spectacularly painful fashion around a year later. By that time, we were engaged, and let's just say she made it clear she really wanted to be with someone else, someone she soon left me for. It may sound simple to say that I was devastated, and yet I still struggle to find words that convey the depth of my grief at that time. Try as I might to cultivate affirming thoughts for myself, to pore over advice columns and breakup tips, I was plunged into a time of profound heartache. In his book, A Grief Observed, C.S. Lewis writes about the aftermath of losing his beloved wife, Joy, to cancer. He describes life in the following terms. Quote, "I see the rowan berries reddening, and don't know why they, of all things, should be depressing. I hear a clock strike, and some quality it always had before has gone out of the sound. What's wrong with the world to make it so flat, shabby, worn out looking? Then I remember the agonies, the midnight moments, must in the course of nature die away. But what will follow? What will follow?" After my relationship ended, I found myself staring down many agonies and midnight moments, wondering what would come next and if it could possibly manage to diminish the immense grief I carried. Although I have experienced many individual griefs since that time, the death of my beloved grandmother, the loss of friendships, the onset of a chronic illness that drastically changed my life, I've never experienced something that pierced me to the core the way that particular heartbreak did. Have you ever experienced a grief that comes with great staying power? A grief that seems to sink into your bones and spirit, accompanying you through your daily life and shading everything you do. Have you ever navigated through your own midnight moments, wondering what is going to follow? As Unitarian Universalists, we have long covenanted to abide by our third and seventh principles, to accept one another and encourage each other's spiritual growth, to respect the interdependent web of existence of which we are all a part. I want to suggest today that grief is a difficult and precious part of that interdependent web, just as it can be a difficult and precious aspect of sharing in community and exploring spiritual growth. And I think this is familiar to many of us. After all, one of our most cherished UU rituals is our time of joys and sorrows, where we can share the things that we are celebrating and the things that we are grieving. I believe that we return to this ritual week after week because it provides us space to share vulnerably with our community. Our dominant culture tends to deny us this kind of space, especially when it comes to grief. We are expected to either perform someone else's idea of what grief should look like, or bounce back immediately from our brushes with heartache. We can tend to minimize grief, especially in large systems. It's easier to brush it under the rug or to try to erase it entirely. Because grief can be an inconvenient guest. It is messy, and it often hangs around when we are trying to shake it off. It disturbs our relationships with both ourselves and others. It intrudes on our thoughts and habits. It can feel both all-consuming and unnoticeable to the outside world. And there is no set timetable for grief. It comes and it goes, and sometimes it just stays. Living with grief can be quite challenging. And I believe it is a necessary and foundational aspect of that interdependent web that connects us all. This morning, I want to invite us to consider 3 ways I think we might engage grief from Unitarian Universalist perspectives. To quote C.S. Lewis again, this time from The Four Loves, "To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe. But in that dark, airless, motionless, safe space, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable. To love is to be vulnerable." Although love doesn't explicitly appear in our 7 or 8 principles, it clearly underpins them and weaves them together. Love does appear twice in our 6 sources, and as the Article 2 UUA Commission states in its new report on how we might update our principles and sources, love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love. In the new image that communicates our shared UU values, the word love appears over a flaming chalice at the heart of the picture. So a deep love of each other and ourselves and the more than human world motivates so much of our communal work and spiritual development. And yet, to love is to open ourselves to the inevitability of grief. To open ourselves to caring deeply about anything is to risk being hurt. To love is to render ourselves vulnerable and to accept that grief will arise in response to changes in our material, emotional, and spiritual conditions. And that opening up can be very hard to do. And it's so worth it. I have never looked back on my life and regretted the choice to love. So this morning, I want to encourage us to find ways to put love into practice, even as we are aware that it can open us to grief. Whether it's serving on a committee, calling a friend or a nemesis to offer companionship, picking up trash on the side of the road, kindling a romance or kindling a friendship, or just accepting ourselves for who we are. Let's care deeply and be vulnerable and open to the wisdom and experience we gain from loving and from grieving as a result of that love. That brings me to the second idea I want to present, something I've come to call the spiral dance of understanding. In the service description this morning, I used another quote from our friend C.S. Lewis, who writes that, quote, "In grief, nothing stays put. One keeps emerging from a phase, but it always recurs, round and round. Everything repeats. Am I going in circles? Or dare I hope that I am on a spiral?" This immediately grabbed my attention because the iconography of spirals have appeared in many cultures and spiritual traditions all over the world. Spirals can signify many things, and they inarguably hold important spiritual messages for many people and cultures. When I studied at Star King School for the Ministry, the school's logo was a spiral, and we were encouraged to think of our life learning as a kind of spiral dance or movement. Sometimes in life, we journey close to the center of the spiral, and sometimes we are far away and feel like we're a million miles from understanding how we connect to anything. I don't know about you, but when I'm experiencing grief, it can almost feel like I'm swept away by it. And sometimes that sweeping takes me towards the heart of the spiral where I understand how I'm connected to everything and things fit together. And sometimes it takes me far away. There can be a feeling, as C.S. Lewis describes, of recurring and going in circles, of being stuck or overwhelmed or just not sure what to do with the grief. Here I turn to the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh, who writes that emotions are like a storm. And if we look at a tree in a storm, the top of that tree might seem like it's going to break. We might be afraid the storm will uproot the tree. But if we turn our attention to the trunk of the tree, we realize that its roots are deeply anchored to the ground, and we can see the tree will stand fast in the storm. Thich Nhat Hanh says that we are like trees, and we must understand emotion as something that arises, remains, and then leaves. Thich Nhat Hanh reminds us that storms arise and they stay for a while and then they dissipate, and urges us to remember in those tough moments on the spiral that we are more than our storms, our strong emotions. He encourages us to connect with our breath and look deeply into the nature of reality and our experiences. And when we look deeply, we uncover the ways we're connected to that interdependent web of life. We understand our own experiences on a deeper level, which doesn't always make them easier to bear, but which can, with time and practice, help us make meaning of what we've been through. So I think grief extends us an invitation to consciously journey on the spiral dance of understanding. It makes no promises as to what we will learn or as to whether we will reach the center of that spiral. And it can be a powerful teacher, bringing us lessons in empathy, compassion, loving kindness, and patience. If we open to it, grief can remind us that though our upper branches may be tossed in a great storm, we are also made up of a trunk and roots, and we can call on our roots, our spiritual practices, our ancestors, our community, our breath. We can call on all of those roots when the weather gets stormy. Finally, I want to invite us to think about grief as an invitation to accept what is. Grief often arises due to a change in circumstances. We lose something or someone that we care deeply about. We grow attached to people, places, and things, and then find ourselves vulnerable as the passage of time brings change. Here I think again of the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh, who tells us that to look deeply means to hold each of our experiences as if they are something precious, offering them tender care and recognition. He teaches us that to look deeply is to practice letting go, and says that suffering is often caused by us not wanting to surrender our ideas of things. He says that freedom is cultivated by the practice of letting go. So when grief comes to us, we can choose to view it as an invitation to this freedom of letting go of our previous attachments and thought patterns, letting go when it's tempting to cling tightly to what has been. We can choose to understand it as an invitation to accept what is, not what we wish were happening, not what we hope will happen, and not what we fear will happen, but what is right now in this moment. As 17th century Japanese poet Mizuta Masahide wrote so expressively, quote, "Barns burnt down. Now I can see the moon." When our barns burn down and we find ourselves in the midnight moments, we can recognize the loss. We can accept the pain that comes with a great change to part of our life that we've loved. We can choose to try to distance ourselves from the pain or ignore it, or spend mighty efforts trying to bring another version of reality into being. We can also choose to hold the smoking ruins of that barn tenderly, preciously, and accept that the grief of losing the barn and the barn being gone means we have a view of something miraculous, the moon. As we each navigate the griefs that life brings our way, I encourage us to keep choosing vulnerability, to keep risking the heartache that comes with loving anything. I encourage us to mindfully journey on the spiral dance of understanding, remembering that we have many sources of wisdom and strength to draw on when the going gets rough. And I invite us to accept what is, to find ourselves amidst the embers of our former barns, and in the middle of all of it, to witness the moon. May we all find the moon in those moments, and may we have the support of this beloved community in our midnight moments and our journeys along the spiral. Amen, Selah, blessed be, and may it be so.